Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Sophia Herrero, and I'm on the Amplify Science team. Welcome, everyone, to tonight's webinar, How the Integration of Literacy and Science Instruction Supports Accelerated Learning. So that's a mouthful. That is a lot, and we have a lot to cover today. But while we wait for a few more people to trickle in, I just wanted to say welcome and have everyone introduce themselves in the chat. So make sure you're in the chat and say hi and tell us where you're from and what your role is in your school. Hi, Jody. Hi, Danielle. Let us know where you're from, where you're located in the US. Woburn, Massachusetts. Oh my gosh, I have family there. Yeah. Wow, I have so much in common with all the people today. I went to Johns Hopkins. Thanks, Chris. All right, I see a lot of people from Indiana. Welcome, everyone. And I see a lot of different kinds of roles within the school, and we'll get some more information from you in just a second. Welcome, Elizabeth. Love seeing first grade in the house. Some younger grades. Hi, Obi. We'll just wait one more minute before we move on. All right. In the interest of time, just because I know we have so much to do tonight and you all have lives to get to, I'm going to get started. But first, we have a couple of questions we want to learn about you. So my amazing colleague, Liz, has just launched a poll where we can learn some stuff just about you. So we want to know what subject you teach. Do you teach science, literacy, or both? Because we'll be talking about both today. And what grade levels do you work with? So that is our younger grades, upper elementary, any of those. Just let us know what you teach. Fun fact, I've taught most of those grade levels. And while we're waiting for that poll to get finished, just wanted to give some just logistics for today. So we do have a Q&A today, and at the end of our session, you'll have a chance to ask our panelists some amazing questions. So make sure that you are asking all of those questions in the Q&A and not the chat. If you want to ask any other questions that aren't towards them, absolutely put those in the chat. If you want to interact with each other, go ahead and put that in the chat. But that Q&A is specifically for those kinds of questions that you want to get answered. And I think, Liz, we should be ready for our poll. Awesome. Looks like we have all K-5s today. That's awesome. As K-5 teacher, love to see it. Perfect. All right, let's keep moving. So we have a pretty packed agenda today. So first, we're going to talk with Natalie Wexler, and you'll learn more about her in just a second. And we are going to be discussing literacy instruction versus content area instruction. And then after that, we're going to hear from Rebecca Abbott all about accelerating learning through literacy-rich science. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A. So let's learn a little bit more about our panelists today. So you might have seen Rebecca Abbott before if you've done any Amplify Science PD with us. So Rebecca Abbott is a professional learning lead with the Learning Design Group at the Lawrence Hall of Science. She is amazing. She has so much experience both in the classroom and from the Lawrence Hall of Science. And I like to think of her as the literacy guru at the Lawrence Hall of Science. She might say otherwise. And she has so much experience with ELLs, with English language learners. And as one of those myself, I really appreciate that about her. So thanks for Rebecca for joining us today. Awesome. And we also have Natalie Wexler. So you might know Natalie's name because she is an amazing education writer, and she wrote The Knowledge Gap, which, fun fact, Natalie, I don't know if you know this, I might have mentioned this to you before. It was actually, you wrote that about a school that I taught at. Yes, at Capital City here in DC. So when reading that, I was flipping through all the pages saying, wait, I know these people. And it's because you learned all of that amazing information from people I actually know. So she is here today to talk all about things that she's learned, including things from the writing revolution. She is incredible and highly recommend her books. Please read them. All right. So today, we're going to be talking about a lot of really rich topics. So I want to give us some background before we dive in, thinking about accelerated learning and what exactly that is. When you think about accelerated learning, your mind might go directly to something that it isn't, which is remediation. What it actually is getting students access to grade level instruction, some rigorous supports, and making sure that they get strong instruction, even if they might have some misconceptions from previous grades, to get them where they need to be. So we're going to look at that from two different angles, from literacy and from science. And I'm really excited to learn from both Natalie and Rebecca today. So let's kick it off with Natalie Wexler. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can learn from her. All right.
Thank you, Sophia. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Get to the slideshow. There we go. So, as Sophia mentioned, I'm going to talk about, well, really not literacy instruction versus content area instruction. I mean, I think that is often how those things have been conceived of, that they're separate. So traditionally on the literacy side, we've had foundational skills, phonemic awareness, phonics, foundational reading skills, foundational writing skills as well, one hopes. And then a lot of time spent on reading comprehension skills and strategies, like finding the main idea. There's often a skill of the week that students will practice on texts at their individual reading levels. And those texts will be on random topics, because the idea is we're not teaching content knowledge in the literacy block. We are developing those skills. And then, as I mentioned, there might be some attention to writing, often not a whole lot, but those foundational skills like letter formation. And then often the writing will be maybe personal narrative, your own experience or your own opinion about something, or it could be about topics in a separate writing curriculum, rather than anything in the content area of the academic day, which those things that are considered to be content areas are things like social studies, the arts, and science, which of course is the topic we're focusing on today. And so the idea has been that we develop these things separately, literacy skills and on the one hand, and content knowledge on the other. Now, it's not that elementary teachers don't think science and social studies are important. They do. This is a poll that was done a few years ago on the attitudes towards science, and also they did some on social studies among K-3 teachers, school leaders, district leaders. And as you can see, all of those groups thought teaching science is important, that it developed understanding of science, interest in science, reading comprehension of texts about science. And they also felt, a majority of all three groups felt, that daily instruction in science is important. But do kids actually get daily instruction in science? Not really, not very often. Teachers, it's been found that schools spend much less time on science and social studies than on reading and math. So this is a graph of data from the federal government that was collected from about 7,000 elementary school students. How much time do they spend on each of these subjects: ELA, math, science, social studies, etc. And of course, the lion's share of the time, about 2 hours a day, is spent on ELA. That probably won't surprise you if you teach in an elementary school. And then science gets just, theoretically at least, about 30 minutes a day. And I would say that's optimistic, especially in schools where test scores are low, because the theory is, well, if we want to get those reading scores up, we need to work on reading. Both phonemic awareness and phonics, but a lot of the time spent on those skills that appear to be assessed by standardized tests, like finding the main idea, like making inferences. The interesting thing about this data, so a couple of researchers looked at this data that had been collected by the federal government, and they asked, what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day than average on social studies? And they found that that was correlated with higher reading test scores, especially for kids from low-income backgrounds. They looked at what happens if kids get an extra half an hour a day on ELA or reading, and they found that that was not correlated with higher reading test scores. So why would that be? Well, we'll talk about that. But first, why is it that teachers aren't spending more time on science in kindergarten through third grade? Well, the primary perceived reason not to do that is the need to prepare for those state tests in reading and math. They're much more emphasized than any state tests in science content knowledge. So the idea is, well, we gotta get those scores up. Eventually kids can learn about science, but first they need to learn to read and they need to learn these comprehension skills. But the thing is, science tells us, cognitive science, the science of learning, tells us that actually knowledge is more important for reading comprehension than skills. Those skills really won't work if you don't have enough knowledge to understand the passage you're trying to read, at least at a superficial level. And where does that knowledge come from? Actually, from subjects like social studies and science. So for example, there's a very strong correlation, it's been found, between general academic knowledge, like knowing the answer to in what part of the body does pneumonia occur, which is technically science knowledge, right? And general reading comprehension. So the more stuff you know, especially sort of academic stuff, the more likely you are to be able to understand any text that you're asked to read. And that suggests that what we really should be doing to boost reading comprehension is giving kids as much access as possible to academic knowledge and vocabulary, not so much just working on these supposedly abstract reading comprehension skills. So why is this? What's going on in the mind that makes knowledge so important to comprehension? Well, the explanation has to do with the way we take in new information and try to make sense of it. And the important box in this diagram is that one labeled working memory. So working memory is very limited in its capacity. And it's the aspect of our consciousness where we are trying to take in, consciously take in and understand new information. It can only hold about 4 to 5 items for about 20 seconds before it starts to get overwhelmed. And we start to have problems with comprehension and ability to analyze this information and retain it. And that burden on working memory is called cognitive load. So if there's too much cognitive load, we don't have the capacity to learn. Now, the way around that limitation on working memory is this last box, long-term memory, which is potentially infinite. And if we have relevant information stored in long-term memory about what we're reading, we don't have to juggle that in working memory. We can just sort of withdraw it from long-term memory, and that gives us more space in working memory for understanding the new information we're trying to take in. There are a couple of tricks here, though. One is we first have to transfer new information to long-term memory, And we also have to be able to retrieve that information when we need it. And a great way to transfer new information to long-term memory is to attach meaning to it. And that could be by explaining it to somebody else orally or in writing. For retrieval, what really helps is to practice retrieving it. So the more we retrieve an item of information, the more likely we are to be able to retrieve it when we need it. And again, one thing that really helps with that is explaining it to somebody in our own words, if possible. So that's the basic cognitive architecture, the explanation of why having prior relevant knowledge helps us with comprehension. It's also important to start building academic knowledge and vocabulary early. Why? Well, there's something called the Matthew effect in reading. And what that tells us is that the gap between good readers and poor readers expands every year that goes by if kids are not learning foundational skills, but also if they're not acquiring academic knowledge and vocabulary. Because as you can see in the early years, in the early grades, the gap between the kids who start out with more academic knowledge and vocabulary, probably because they've been able to pick it up at home from more highly educated parents, the gap between them and the other kids is relatively small. But what happens is those readers who start out with more academic knowledge, they're reading more complex texts in our leveled reading system, and they also have relevant knowledge for that new information and vocabulary to stick to. So new knowledge will stick best to related knowledge. It's been said that knowledge is kind of like Velcro. It sticks best to other related knowledge. But those poor readers, they don't have as much of that other half of the Velcro. So they are not reading more sophisticated text, and they're also not retaining whatever new information there is in that, the text they're reading, because they don't have anything for it to stick to. So by the time kids get to high school, this gap can be very wide indeed and very hard to narrow. And yet at the high school level, we expect kids to read and understand textbooks like this, even though they may not really have gotten any science instruction, maybe through middle school, because of this emphasis on reading and math skills. So what do we want to do to accelerate learning, to enable kids who may have gaps in knowledge to access grade level material? Well, what really works, rather than going back in and trying to fill in all the gaps that kids might have in their knowledge, which could take forever, is to weave literacy instruction and science together, teach them in it simultaneously. And studies of this kind of approach have shown, first of all, that this is in kindergarten, better reading comprehension after just 1 year or less. That's even on a standardized test. That's not, the passages on that test are not related to what they've actually learned, but they've been able to acquire new vocabulary that helps them understand the passages on the test. A significant increase in reading motivation, and that students who get this kind of combination of literacy and content area instruction are more likely to be identified as among the strongest students in the following year. And a meta-analysis, so an analysis of, I think it was about 35 different studies of this kind of instruction that weaves literacy and content area instruction together, found statistically significant effects on comprehension, on vocabulary, and probably not surprisingly, on their content knowledge. And there is more research coming that is really promising about this kind of approach. So I'd like to talk for a minute about how writing activities can accelerate learning. We really, as I mentioned, don't pay enough attention to writing, don't spend enough time teaching writing or having students write. But well-designed writing activities can do a number of things. First of all, identify those gaps in knowledge that are going to prevent students from engaging with grade level material, so we know what to focus on. What is it that we need to, what knowledge do we need to give students so that they can do what we want them to do this year? And so having students write about what they're learning can really pinpoint misconceptions, gaps that are preventing them from accessing that grade level material. And it can do that before it's too late, before the end of the year or even a month later. If you weave writing into content area instruction, you're getting pretty immediate gauges of where students are and what they may not be understanding. And we know that writing about what they're learning in any subject area enhances students, boosts student learning. When you write about learning, it really deepens comprehension, cements knowledge. And that has to do with that transfer of information to long-term memory and practicing retrieval of the information from long-term memory. And here is a slide that illustrates that. So remember that for both transfer and retrieval, what's really powerful is explaining new information or information that you may have slightly forgotten to someone else in your own words. And that is what we do when we write. The problem is writing is so hard, much harder than reading, that working memory can easily get overburdened when we ask inexperienced writers to write. So to unlock the potential of writing instruction, we need to do a couple of things. First of all, modulate that heavy cognitive load by beginning at the sentence level if that's what students need. Many students, even at upper grade levels, have never been explicitly taught how to construct a sentence. And if writing is hard, writing at length just makes it harder. So by modulating cognitive load, we're opening up capacity and working memory for students to learn how to write, but also to get those knowledge building benefits of writing. And secondly, embed writing activities in the content of the core curriculum, including in science, rather than having kids write about separate topics or their own experience. If we're doing that, we're not taking advantage of the power of writing to boost students' learning of what we want them to acquire. So the only method I know of that combines both of these things is called the Writing Revolution. It's the title of a book I'm the co-author of, but my co-author, Judith Hochman, is the one who developed this method, and she's a veteran educator who developed it over a number of years. So just to give you a quick example of what this method looks like in practice, I'm going to show you just one sentence level activity that is part of the Writing Revolution method, which doesn't stop at sentences, but it does begin there. So let's say that you're teaching about plants and seeds. You could give students sentence stems that they need to finish with each of these conjunctions: because, but, and so. Seeds need light to grow because, but, and so. Now, each of these sentence stems, simple as they are, require students to retrieve a different kind of information that they may have slightly forgotten in long-term memory and put it into their own words. They obviously need to have that information. This is not the way to introduce a new topic because they already need to have that information. But in the process of writing about it, they are deepening their understanding of the topic. They're also learning how to use conjunctions. So there are different responses that students could supply, but here are some possibilities. Oh, well, I guess I'm not going to give you those possibilities. Whoops, let me go back to the slideshow. Well, I'll just continue here because I'm almost finished. So professional learning about all of this is crucial because this is not something that teachers will have learned about in their pre-service training, but not professional learning as we have known it. So not just a one-day or a half-day workshop on how to foster critical thinking in general. That has been found not to work. The kind of professional learning that can work is, first of all, rooted in the specific content of the curriculum. And secondly, so if you want kids to think about what they're learning about seeds, that's what we need to focus on. And also not just a one-day or half-day workshop, but something that is ongoing and cyclical. And that could include coaching and teachers coming together and talking about what they're doing and how it's going. That's the kind of professional learning that has been found to work. So I will stop my share there and turn it over to Rebecca.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm like writing down notes because of all of the connections that from what you're saying to what I'm about to introduce too. There's just so rich, and I appreciated a lot of the research that you brought up for those. So thanks. All right, I'll go ahead and share my screen as well. Let's see there. All right, so you can see my slides. All right, great. All right, so just to give a quick context for the work that I do. So the title of this section is called Accelerating Learning Through Literacy-Rich Science. And again, this sort of theme today is about accelerating learning, supporting students to engage with grade level content and grade level learning, even if there's been some gaps in their learning, probably due to schooling disruptions over the last few years due to COVID and all of the issues we know are happening in your educators' contexts in terms of teacher shortages and so forth. So I work at UC Berkeley's Lawrence Hall of Science, and the area that we've been focusing on for this accelerating learning is this intersection between literacy and science. Our group is a curriculum development and a research group, and we've been developing curriculum over the last number of years to meet the next generation science standards, or NGSS. And even if you're in a state that's not using NGSS as is, the sort of paradigm shifts that we're seeing right now are pretty applicable to everyone who's engaging in science teaching and learning across the country. So our group, the Learning Design Group, was started by a researcher named P. David Pearson. He was the dean of the UC Berkeley School of Education, and Jackie Barber, who is the science specialist. So it was a literacy and science collaboration from the beginning. And I'm going to start off with this one quote, which David Pearson said, which is, "Literacy is a domain in search of content." So in other words, reading comprehension, as Natalie was saying, involves making sense of text, and that text can't be without context. It needs to be about something. And Natalie made this case. She said, knowledge is more important to reading comprehension than general skills. And the only way to acquire this general academic knowledge and vocabulary is through the acquisition of knowing of topics and of content, and promoting that to long-term memory. So what I want to talk about is the flip side of this, and that, interestingly enough, is that engaging in science also requires language. And so what that means is that we can see the two of them as mutually supportive. So what's happening in the science world right now? And we'll take a step back to think about the broad goals for science and engaging in science thinking and learning, is thinking about what do science and scientists and the rest of us get curious about. What do they study? Well, they study about the things that are on my slide here. Things like the natural phenomena that occur in the universe, the things we want to ask questions about, wonder about, get curious about. Why does lightning happen? How do roller coasters work? The things we want to use our science knowledge to explain or predict. Knowing more about natural and design phenomena in the world helps us all design, helps us make decisions, help us thrive as a society. And so what we've been calling this is a focus on phenomena. And the field of science education has undergone a major paradigm shift to reflect this. So in the last 10 years, the paradigm shift has moved towards a phenomena-based approach. And so I'll give you a few classroom examples of what this might look like in classroom instruction. A phenomena-based approach is something like investigating the things on the right, where students would be engaging in exploring real-world problems. So these things like storms and where sea turtles are able to survive, and volcanoes, or we could talk about current topics such as an earthquake. They're complex phenomena, and they require students to dive into sustained deep learning experiences where they need to gather evidence and do the sense making. Now, the topics on the left, in contrast, don't necessarily bring up that same curiosity and engagement in the same way. Now, these ideas on the left can and should be part of the study while students are figuring out the phenomena on the right, but topic-based instruction in and of itself is not necessarily conducive for that deep learning. And what I was writing down was how that relates to the working memory versus the long-term memory. The things on the left, you can memorize things about the water cycle, but when you transfer them to applying them to a phenomena and really figuring out why storms in the area have become more severe, that's really leading to that deeper level of transfer and that deeper level of knowledge. Now, this is a big shift from standards in the past. Those of us who remember being in science classes itself is very much so learning about topics and checking off those things, memorizing facts, memorizing definitions. But instead, really, the paradigm shift is having students engage in those sustained investigations over time and figuring out phenomena. And so the implications for the classroom mean it's very different now, where a phenomena-based approach shifts the focus in a classroom from learning about to figuring out. The learning about refers to the topics like the water cycle or ecosystems, and this often feels like what we remember as school learning. So topic-based approaches keep students in the role of a student, whereas phenomena-based approaches focused on figuring out put students in the role of a scientist or an engineer. It really moves students to the center of the investigation. They're the ones figuring out phenomena and they're using the practices of science. And so one great thing about this approach is that it's really authentic to the work that scientists actually do. Scientists gather information, they investigate, they work to articulate their processes, and they collaborate and they communicate with other scientists. And language comprehension plays a crucial role in this process. There's talking and reading and writing and listening. And so in this paradigm shift to a phenomena-based approach, we are aiming to provide these same opportunities for students. And this is why we say engaging in science requires language. So as I mentioned, we're a curriculum development group. And so I wanted to show you a brief example from what this looks like in a unit that we've created in Amplify Science, which goes from kindergarten through 8th grade. So in this particular 4th grade unit, there's a phenomenon that many students, and probably you all, can relate to, which is there was a blackout one night. Everything was on and then suddenly all the lights were out. And so how did this happen? What happened? What happened in the town? How widespread was it, et cetera? And so to figure something out like a scientist, students would ask questions. They would investigate electrical systems. They would discuss their findings, and they would research how electrical devices even work, how electrical grid works. They would look at books, they would look at simulations, all of those things. And in other words, we can say that they do talk, read, write, and visualize as they work to figure out. They go through this cycle a few times as they find out more and more and more to answer the questions about how blackouts might occur. And so the approach that we've developed includes not just the science content acquisition, but also supports for developing the language they need to communicate about science and to discuss science and to make those written explanations. And so this does come in the form sometimes of sentence level supports. We've also got vocabulary routines that are embedded into instruction, and plenty of discussion routines and a print-rich environment, just to name a few. So in other words, we've designed scaffolds, routines, and materials for language directly into the science program. But successful language development doesn't just come from these supports. It's also because the reading and writing is happening within this authentic context, with an authentic purpose for doing so in the service of figuring out those science ideas. And so, for example, when it comes to writing, they're not just writing about topics like writing an essay or a report, but rather they'd be writing to synthesize their ideas, to explain their thinking to others, to make a scientific argument like a scientist. So explicitly teach that kind of genre writing, even down to the sentence level, and ensure students have opportunities to practice doing it over the course of a unit. And so this multimodal approach is something that we've also have our own research on to show that it's a better way to teach science and a better way to teach literacy. And so a few of the graphs from that, we had these independent evaluators from the Center for Research on Evaluation Standards and Students Testing, CREST, and the references there at the bottom of your slide. So they did a side-by-side comparison with students using this multimodal approach in green compared to the business as usual approach in blue. And you can see this is the 3 measures you see on this slide are reading comprehension. So you can see reading comprehension, like we were discussing, is enhanced when they had the content-rich surround, 51 to 83%. Science vocabulary also increased, as did their content knowledge. And then if we just took a subset of the study, it was just about writing. And so the different components, strength of introduction, evidence, clarity, conclusion, all of those were enhanced as well because they had the content to write about, as well as the language and literacy instruction. And finally, we took a subset of the students and looked at how our multilingual learners, our English learners did in this context as well. And they actually outperformed the general conclusions data that we saw a couple slides ago, but huge gains in reading comprehension, vocabulary, and science content knowledge for our multilingual learners as well. So we know this approach works. And we advocate for this multimodal approach to science learning as a way to meet your literacy goals, because you have this rich content surround where students are learning literacy in the service of knowledge building, where they're figuring out science ideas. But as Natalie was pointing to, part of the issue is where science is increasingly not treated as a core subject. It's taking a back seat oftentimes when it comes. And this is not quite going in the right direction either. So this graph has comparison data from 2000 and then 2018 National Survey of Science and Mathematics shows that, that the numbers are actually going down. So in K3 from 2000 to 2018, that's actually decreased in the number of minutes. And same thing with in upper grades, 4th through 6th grade, they're getting less minutes of science per week in classrooms. And the educators I've polled in the last couple of years since 2018 have told me it's gone down even farther, as teachers are sort of scrambling to pick back up after the schooling losses of the last couple of years. They really have to double down on ELA and have found even less minutes for science. So there's been a big call in the field for more science and for better science. And there's a few organizations such as the National Academy of Science, the National Science Teachers Association, and then other sort of groups that are just generally looking at student success, like Student Achievement Partners, and talking about how science needs to be a national priority. If you're an individual teacher, it's really hard to go from the ground up and put more science time in your classroom, because as a nation, as a country, we just don't have that same priority built into our systems and built into our curricular materials. A really recent report from the National Academy of Science has an urgent call to action, saying that scientific thinking and understanding are essential for all people navigating the world, not just for scientists, and that knowledge of science and the practice of science are just essential components of a fully functioning democracy. And so with that in mind, there's been a lot of urgent calls to action of bringing science in. And because of this, I think a lot of us are saying that why not infuse it into the language arts and literacy, which we also know students so urgently need. That by giving students an opportunity to develop their language and their literacy through a context of science, you can really be powerful in doing both. So that's another quote about the sort of national scale of this. And so in our work, we're really encouraged by this pairing, like I was saying, using science as a context for content-rich learnings. We can not only start to address the dearth of science instruction time in our schools, but we can use it as a powerful way to accelerate student learning. And we think science is a powerful context for a number of reasons. One, because it's multidimensional, meaning students leverage literacy, math, technological, social skills and they have to engage with their social emotional beings as well and grow them as needing to meet the demands of the engaging and complex investigations that they're conducting in science. The other reason is because high quality science instruction really values students' experiences and their cultural backgrounds as assets. So in order to figure out, students have to bring their ways of understanding the world, their knowledge base, to be able to explain real world phenomena, their data, their observations. And science is really about bringing these backgrounds and experiences to the table and supporting them and accelerating their learning. And finally, science provides an engaging context. We all know that getting excited about phenomena or getting excited about science time is something that happens all the time in schools. And in contrast to typical approaches like remediation, which is only really on skill building or backfilling on content, science teaching can really focus on building grade level knowledge. And so this ensures that those who have fallen behind don't continue to do this and can be engaged in the learning and see themselves as scientific thinkers. All right, so I'll pause there because I know we have probably a few questions and other topics that we're going to bring up next. But thank you.
All right, thank you so much to both of you. 1 second, I'm going to share my screen. All right, So we have a few minutes and I would love to have a session for Q&A because I don't know about everyone else listening, but that was just so much just thrown at me and it was incredible, but I need some time to process things sometimes. So I will throw out a question first while other people can think of their own questions. So this is directed towards both of you. So how do we make science education fun to implement? And how do we make it more accessible? Rebecca was just mentioning how kids get really excited and engaged in science content, but how can we do that more so? And I see Rebecca smiling already if you want to go first.
Sure. Well, I was just thinking about elementary teachers, and I think we have a lot of them in the audience. And I know one issue is that a lot of elementary teachers haven't had a ton of their own science professional learning. And that makes it hard. That makes it like, oh, I don't know if I know how to teach this, or, a little worrisome. And, am I going to know enough to be able to work with the kiddos on these particular subject areas? The great thing about the approach on the teacher standpoint is that you don't need to know all of the facts or all the information. It's because of this process of figuring out. It's something that you facilitate for the kids, and they're going to have lots of questions, and you can say, I don't know, how could we find that out? Or what could we investigate? Or what evidence would we need? And then they go through the process of figuring it out, and you can all do that together. So, that you will have a teacher's guide or some background information to help you if you need it, but it's not like in the moment you need to be presenting science information as if you were the, the sage on the stage, as we say. But for kids, I think that it's fun because, again, they can relate to it. They notice everyday phenomena in their day-to-day lives, and they just enjoy the process of relating and connecting what they're figuring out in school to what their families and their communities are doing as well.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. I think Rebecca's in a better position to answer this question. I am not a science educator myself, but I think that kids, I have a natural curiosity about the world, and I think science education is, if done well, is definitely going to be fun for them. I think making it accessible. I think we ought to think about things like making sure they've got the vocabulary they need so that they're not just having fun, but they're also really actually learning and retaining information and vocabulary. And if you, as I mentioned, if you don't have some prior knowledge for information to stick to, it may not stick very well. So something like writing about what they are doing, what they've just done in a manageable way with explicit instruction and how do you construct a sentence that's going to convey all the information that you want to, and be understandable. I think that, is often find that kids are reluctant to write. Teachers often aren't sure about how to teach writing because they haven't gotten great training in doing that. But if you break down that process into manageable chunks, it is both, it's possible to teach it, and it really unlocks a lot of student engagement and potential.
And I totally agree, Natalie. Students are always so curious already, and they can be engaged very easily. And I was just thinking about what you said, Rebecca, of kids, and you don't have to be that like content expert, especially in the younger grades. I'm thinking back to like my third grade classroom, and I remember a piece of advice that someone gave me of like, you don't need to know everything, and just the humility of saying that to kids helps them with the idea of figuring it out too, because you're also figuring it out sometimes, and that's totally okay. I noticed that someone put some thoughts into the chat too. And it's not necessarily a question, but I feel like this is something both of you could speak to. So Elizabeth is talking about how they have very minimal time for science content within the day. So only 20 minutes. What are your thoughts about that? I'm thinking specifically, Rebecca, how to partner with your grade level partners and how to support science there.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Something that a lot of teachers struggle with. They are only sort of allotted I mean, even having 20 minutes a day, if it's every day, is more than a lot of teachers say. Sometimes it's once a week. I think Natalie had, saying that teachers want to do it every day, but some of the statistics, but don't have the time to. So one suggestion, and comes from a case study of a district that I know, is that they really spent the time, like their first year, they taught, 1 unit of science, and then taught their regular ELA curriculum. But then after they taught that, they sat down and they looked at where were all the connections, and they couldn't really do it until they'd experienced both curriculum, and knew them really well. So it's a slow process, I guess, is the long way to say that. Like, don't think you have to do it year 1 of adopting new curriculum, because it takes a while. It takes a while to really see where are the connections between ELA and science. So for example, that example I was just showing of the blackouts, there's some times that kids need to explain and verbally and write nonfiction texts and make an argument. And if there's a writing unit that supports that, you can think about the timing of that. Oh, I could teach this writing unit first, and then they practice it during their science, or vice versa. And it can let you compact your curriculum a little bit, where maybe there's repeats or carryover where you don't have to teach it with both. You could do it, have one reinforce the other. But it takes a few years, I would say, and a concerted time and effort of a team sitting down together and sort of mapping out where those matches and alignment are. What do you think, Natalie? Do you have advice for that?
Yeah, my advice would be it's great to spend time on science per se, but it's also possible to bring science content into the ELA block. And a great way to do that is to read aloud to the entire class a series of texts on a particular topic. So it could be electricity, I don't know, whatever. And the reason, so first of all, these should be complex texts that are grade level or above, that are more challenging than what those kids could probably read themselves, because we know that listening comprehension exceeds reading comprehension on average through about age 13. So kids are going to be able to take in more complex information and vocabulary through listening than through their own reading. And this doesn't even have to, kids are going to be interested in lots of things, but you can also read like biographies or narratives that convey a lot of science information that kids can get very engaged in, and then have kids talk about that content, the entire class, using the vocabulary that they've just heard. Or remember, when you explain something to another person, that helps it stick in long-term memory. So that discussion is going to be really helpful. And then even if you don't have a whole lot of time for science per se, you can also have kids then write about, in a manageable way, write about the content that they have just listened to and spoken about, and also have them read about it. So have books at various levels of difficulty on the same topic that you've just read aloud about, that you've just had discussion about, because once kids have that information in long-term memory, they are probably going to be able to read about it and write about it at a higher level.
And I'd add the other modalities as well, because like I was talking about in my slides, the doing and the visualizing is super important as well. So if you have all the modalities, I feel like it even boosts them farther. They can, if they're using that vocabulary while they're doing, if they're using that vocabulary while they're visualizing or doing a simulation and reading and listening to those books, then they have additional practice opportunities to use those concepts as words.
Yeah.
And we have another question. You just mentioned vocabulary, narrowing in on a specific topic. So thinking of what are some vocabulary strategies that you would both recommend for science content? I know that could be really big or really specific. So.
Well, I guess I'll just jump in, and I'm sure Rebecca has something else she'd like to add, but vocabulary shouldn't be thought of really as separate from knowledge. Vocabulary is just the tip of an iceberg of knowledge, usually. And it's important to teach certain vocabulary words directly, explicitly, but you can't teach, it's not possible to teach all of the vocabulary words that kids need to acquire in the early years of their schooling. Especially, it's been estimated that they really need to acquire about 8 vocabulary words every day to get to where they need to be. You can't directly teach all of those things. But if you're expanding knowledge about a topic, what happens is that kids pick up the meanings and retain these other words that are associated with the words you're directly teaching. And that's the way to expand knowledge. And the way to really ensure that it sticks in long-term memory is having them use that vocabulary in their speaking and in their writing.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. And I did not know that statistic. That's really astounding. 8 words a day. It would be impossible. And so the piece I would add to that is just a caution not to pre-teach vocabulary, or that often that is sort of an older way we do it. Let's learn this list of vocabulary words, then we're going to use them in an upcoming set of activities. It's really not necessary to do that, because like Natalie said, if you're learning them in context alongside of good content instruction, those vocabulary words will come. Especially if they're represented multiple times through writing, through listening, through speaking, through reading. But then you do have to formalize them at some point and explicitly teach them. That point, I would say, is not at the beginning of a series of instruction, but sort of in the middle and towards the end, where they get stamped. Now that you've been using these words a lot and hearing these words a lot and engaging with these words a lot, let's define them and see what they really mean. So that's the explicit part.
All right. This is a pretty long question, so I'll just read it directly. So this person was having a conversation with their district science specialist about this. So they want to know how to ensure grading is fair. So they would hate to use the same kind of grading scale for across subject areas. Since you teach ELA standards during the ELA block using science content. How can you conduct the inquiry piece during science time and grade that, plus giving science content assessments?
Well, I guess I would say that I would think of it not as teaching the ELA standards. So you really can't teach those standards directly. They're, something, if the standard is students will be able to find the main idea and details, that's not an abstract thing, that they can't do that unless they have some knowledge of the content. So I don't think it's really possible to separate the grading from the knowledge of the content and those standards. When it comes to writing, yes, I mean, there's knowledge and there's the ability to express it in writing. But I would say to think of the grading as tied to the content knowledge. So, and it's not that you don't care whether students can say make inferences, but I would ask, can they make an inference about a topic that they have just learned about? So it's not just reciting facts, it's also applying that knowledge, but it has to be knowledge that they've acquired, or they're just not, you can't make an inference about something you don't have knowledge about. I don't know, Rebecca, you have something?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, and I would say, yeah, it's hard to separate them out. But of course, like rubrics are one way to do that, where you would have to take a look at a piece of student work or listen to what a student said and think about how they're using, what are sort of the pieces of content that you can see them working towards, and what are the pieces of ELA or language that they're working on, and do see them sort of separately. And I don't think you need to conduct them separately during science time and that kind of thing, because I think they're too integrated in the first place to be able to do that. I guess the other thing I would say is that I would never do it on a single event or piece of writing. It depends on sort of the goal for your grades, that if you had a few pieces of work or a few instances where you were listening to kids if they were little, you'd have to sort of give a cumulative grade or an ongoing grade, or see how students were growing over time. So if the purpose is just to give them a final summative grade, it would have to be a very carefully crafted piece of, of an assessment, either from a program that sort of helps you parse out the language versus the content integration. We have some of those pieces in our program where we talk about argumentation writing, for example, and like, well, do they have a claim? Can they support it with evidence? And those are some of the sort of writing pieces. But are they using evidence about the phenomena or about the science topic in order to support that evidence? So they know blank, blank, and blank in order to provide evidence. So that separates it out a little bit. But really, I think overall, the sort of cumulative, formative sort of grades or understanding how students are understanding is a different type of assessment than, I'm not sure if the one you're talking about is more of a summative type of thing or more of a ongoing progress monitoring type of thing. So I'd have a different answer for those two.
Yeah. So you both talked a lot about how much time is spent for literacy within the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So Laura asked a really great question of how much time is the ideal time to spend on science and or social studies?
I'll take a stab at that. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm not sure, I could come up with a specific amount of time, but I do think a lot of the time we spend in the reading block is time that is not well spent, because it is an attempt to directly teach and have kids just sort of practice these skills and strategies that really don't work in the abstract, that can't be directly taught in the absence of content. And so if we cut down on the amount of time we're spending on that, and the average time spent on ELA or reading is 2 hours, and sometimes it's 3 hours. In K through 2, maybe 20 to 30 minutes of that would be on foundational skills. And the other, hour and a half or more, we can do lots of things that build content knowledge in both science and social studies. And I think whether you bring science and social studies into the ELA block, or whether you cut down on the ELA block and devote more time to science and social studies, the fact is we do have time to do all of those things. And if we integrate things like getting kids to think about making inferences about content, if we integrate that into science and social studies instruction, we could spend an hour or 45 minutes a day on each.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I don't know that I have seen an actual study that recommends like the ideal amount of time, but I agree with what you're saying, that you could spend more time on each, because it's so inclusive of all of the language practice opportunities.
All right. And we only have a couple of minutes left. So we have one final question from myself. So the theme of language is through everything we talked about. What does that mean to both of you?
Language. Well, it's kind of everything, right? I mean, it's like once you get past foundational skills in reading and writing, it's all about the language that comes into comprehension, analysis. It's everything we've learned. So I would say, we need to reconceptualize reading, even literacy, and connect it to the science of learning. And what science has discovered, there's a lot of information out there about what works for learning. And I think we need to stop siloing reading, or even reading and writing, off from learning in general, because language encompasses all of that.
Yes, agreed. And I would just say in the science context that the language is part of that authentic need, that, in order to be scientific, to participate in a scientific community, to value what science can bring to your world and how it forms part of your identity, language is involved in all of those processes, to be able to communicate, to be able to understand, to be able to argue and to gather evidence. All of those things are language based. So it's a key part of becoming a scientific thinker.
Wow. This conversation really filled my cup. I'm not sure about both of you or anyone watching. I see a couple of thank yous already, but as we wrap up, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's joined us today, or anyone who is watching this recording. So if anyone's had to leave early, you will all receive a recording of this, and you can watch it on your own time with your teams, anything that you need to do. Thank you so much again for joining us. If you have any questions, you can email us at mail@amplify.com, and we can answer any of those questions whenever you need. And we'll stay on for a couple more minutes, but I just wanted to say thank you again to Natalie and Rebecca for your time this evening. I know, Rebecca, it's afternoon for you. And thank you so much to everyone. Please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, it looks like we don't have any more questions. So thank you so much again. Bye, everyone.